Welcome back to my channel. I'm Brian Kafke, and in today's video I want to talk to you about application development tools, the ones that will give you the easiest and quickest development and yet yield powerful features. And the spoiler alert here is these are the ones that I'm going to highlight specifically. So where are we going? I'll start with why do we even need development tools? After all, we're data engineers and data analysts and stuff, right? Why do we care about this? And maybe you are an actual app developer and you just happened in on this, but you'll probably get a little bit of a different perspective. What are the two types of development tools? And what are my goals in how I'm evaluating and discussing these tools? We'll go through a quick list and then I will do a service by service highlight. Spoiler alert here is that I am very biased because when you're looking for a development tool, you typically have some sort of application in mind and then you kind of filter out. So if your application is very data centric, you may look at something like Python or R as a language you really want to focus on using. If you're developing something that's just meant to be, a mobile app and it's going to be very transactional based, you might be looking at tools like C# or something else. So I'll talk about my bias, but I do want to let you know that part up front, and I'll try to highlight features that even though they may not be what I'm looking for, are pretty cool about a given service. So why dev tools? For my channel and most of my viewers, we're centered on data engineering, data analysis, analytics, and potentially machine learning and data science. And when you're doing that, it can be very difficult to prove to employers that you know what you're talking about, that you can really build things. A good way to do this is to build a career portfolio. And what better way to do that than to create an actual application that can train models, do analytics, do all kinds of cool stuff, visuals, update data, whatever it is you want to do, and you can put it out there. And if it's available as a web app or something that they could even download to their phone and run, that's pretty cool, and that can certainly help sell your skill set and get you a job. The other thing to consider is if you are a data-centric person, which if you watch my channel you probably are, then you should notice out there that the applications, the apps being developed, are incorporating more and more data and AI. You take a phone, you take a picture of something, and then it analyzes the picture, and maybe it tells you where that picture came from. On and on the types of things you could be doing. Maybe you speak to your phone and it uses AI to take what you're saying to it and take an action. There's a lot of ways that apps are incorporating data and AI, machine learning models, and the like. And I think that's only going to keep growing. And there may be any number of reasons you need to build an application. I've had the need to build a code table maintaining application for my ETL processes. You may have a need to build some sort of internal application to help support internal processes like accounting or finance, things like that. You may just want to build an application to become rich and become one of those wealthy people that have an app. Whatever you need, though, there often are reasons why you want to write an application. Now we know the reasons we need to know how to develop applications. Let's look at the two basic types of tools we have. The first type of tool, and arguably the most popular, are web app development tools, which have been massively fueled in popularity due to Bootstrap, which allows us to have a lot more control and dynamic content that adapts well to mobile devices. The nice thing about developing a web app is that it can run anywhere, right? Because our phones and our mobile devices, desktops, and laptops can all run a browser, which means they can run your web app. Typically, web apps are fairly easy to maintain and deploy. You don't have to worry about pushing updates to devices and things because people just go to your website and they're always getting the latest app. You can also integrate web apps into just about anything because we can use REST APIs, so we can connect to any of the 3 major clouds. We can connect to publicly available data. We can pretty much tie into anything we need to. We can even separate out our back end so that we have a web app in one place and a relational database in another, and that's not a problem. And it's nice to not have to deal with an app store. Typically, each app store has its own contracts, its own requirements, and you have to push and maintain your application in each specialized app store. So that's kind of a pain if you don't really need it. So with a web app, you're in control. Let's take a look at the other type of tool, which is a cross-platform mobile app development tool. That's a lot to say. These tools allow us to write apps in one place using a specific language or tool, but then it can be deployed to any of the given platforms we desire to deploy it to, whether that be an iOS type device, an Android device, Windows devices, Linux, etc. We can just run it wherever we need to. So that ability to write once, deploy anywhere is an extremely appealing ability of these development tools. And although we can do that with web app development tools, let me review the features we get when we use this approach. First, In addition to being able to put it into an app store, we may be able to also deploy it as a web app. So we could start using one of these tools and build it as a web app and then extend it to be able to also be deployed as a store app. Not all the services I'll talk about do that. I do know Flutter does that, and I'll talk more about that. So a big benefit is we can monetize our app because it's in the store and we can charge people for it. And if our service is turning this into something that is compiled on each platform, then it's going to run really fast, which a web app may not do. Another nice feature of these types of tools is you're getting a real GUI interface, right? So you're going to get something that is very natural to work with on mobile devices in particular. So we can do things like swipe and different hand gestures, and it can recognize them, which a web app typically cannot. So let me talk about my goals, which are specific to how I looked at these tools and why I filtered some of them out. And I'll talk about that as well. But my number one goal is ease of development. I don't want to be bothered. I'm lazy. I just want to put something out there really cool and slick, but I don't want to have to work at it. I want it to be super easy to deploy. It can be really difficult to take a large, complex web application and deploy all the pieces and configuration necessary to get it to run in, say, a cloud environment or something. I also want something that has a lot of power and extensibility of service. What do I mean by that? I mean that writing a really simple, lightweight application with a tool might be pretty easy, but can it extend more and more features that I need? And will it allow me to just build something that gets more and more complex, so it can adapt with me as my needs grow and doesn't become unwieldy? Scalability is really important these days. Probably the most important part of the scalability would be how many users can use the application at once. But also, of course, the back-end data maintenance side of things, whether it's a relational database or something like Apache Spark, that all has to be taken into account too. But in terms of how many users could use it, some apps may need millions of people to be able to use the application at once and support that, and others could be really small, and we need that ability to adapt. The other part of this, of course, is maintainability. Can we easily configure and modify the way the app runs without having to change code? And this gets into also being able to configure for high reusability. And that gets back to that scalability. Could I, for instance, just set up something where it gives it more memory and capacity and easily scale? Now, my preference is to have a low code or no code solution. I go back to the old days when Visual Basic first came out, and I have to say it was great. You just drag buttons down, write a little code behind the scenes. There was code, but it was really cool that it was driven by a GUI, so I like that. So I'd love to have a solution that allows me to just drop things in and do a low code option. One feature in that case would be something called Flutterflow, which allows you to do that, but it does have code generation under the covers. And to the extent I cannot get a no code, if I need to do coding at all, I would like it to be Python. Python is the sort of definitive data language now. I think it's ubiquitous pretty much across the world, and it's becoming really popular in all walks of programming, including web and mobile app development, especially web apps. I think mobile apps is slowly coming. So here's a quick list of the services I am going to talk about. I'll dig into each one of these a little bit. And let me walk through what I will not talk about, though it may be on your wish list. What I'm not going to talk about: I will not be talking about Ruby. I will not be talking about Rust or Java or the Swift programming languages or Xamarin or JavaScript, which is really LiveScript. They renamed it JavaScript just to confuse everybody. It has no connection to Java. And let me walk through why I'm eliminating some of these. Many people get very excited. They post things like, this is the best thing since sliced bread. But I look at the numbers, and I also look at, does it fit with my own orientation, which is data side of things. So I want things to be easy, and I want it to integrate really well with data science and AI. And I'm not sure these other tools do. But just from a sheer popularity or market share, let's take a look at this for a minute. Ruby is down at number 16. It's, according to this, dropping, and I put the link over to the left is where I got this. Not going to say this is 100% accurate, but I'm guessing it's close enough to get a sense of where things are. And if we believe this, then Ruby is actually at less than 1% of the market share of program development. So I think it's safe to sort of skip that out. We also have Swift and Rust. Now, Swift is specific to the iOS platform, and I'm not a fan of that kind of thing, so I'm kind of dropping it for that reason alone, to be honest. And Rust is also really small percentage, popular in certain niches, but I don't think it really warrants getting into this. And it's also all programming, so I'd have to learn an entire new language and paradigm. Not really into doing that. I'd rather leverage what I know. R is on the uptick. It's a great language. I will talk a little bit about using R to develop applications using something called Shiny. was on my prior slide. But as we look at this, it's pretty clear. R is still an up-and-coming language. It is competing with Python, so R is a pretty good option, but I would argue only if you are already an R developer and you really want to build your app with R. R is not an ideal object-oriented language. It is very much a function-based language. We see JavaScript, and some of the things I'll talk about, I believe, use JavaScript under the covers, but I'm not going to be talking about tools that require you to write code in JavaScript. Java is a great language, but it is typically not run in the browser. It is often used as a back-end server, and so I'm going to leave that off as well. Python, Python is, again, the most ubiquitously popular language across the data world, and so I do want to, per my own requirements, as I mentioned, want to look at tools that use Python. So let's start looking at the services, service by service. The first one I want to talk about is honestly my favorite. It's called Streamlit. I like it because it is so easy to use. Yes, it is code-centric, but it is also Python. You can kind of look at the right-hand side and see just how easy it is to write an app in Streamlit. It provides a local web server, so you can write your app and test it locally, which I love. To get going with Streamlit, you basically just do a pip install. Another thing I love, and you can see how easy the coding is. You just say like import Streamlit as st, and you can import various objects from Streamlit. We can write functions, and what's going on here is we're getting a logger created using that get logger, creating a function to run something, and the st is what we're prefixing to call objects and functions within the st library. And we can see here we're setting a page config to set up title of hello world or hello. We're setting a page icon to show up. We can use st-write to write any kind of markdown to the screen, and we even can create sidebars. Here you can see sidebar success. We can write to the sidebar. There's a lot of stuff here, very intuitive. With very little code you can get a lot working. I've done several videos, and I'll put a link in the description so you can follow my series on Streamlit. But I'm very excited about this, and it is the perfect tool to use if you're trying to build a portfolio, especially in anything related to data, because again, you're showing your chops in how to write Python to write apps, but you're also able to do all kinds of data science and AI types of functionality. So the pros: Streamlit is an open source Python fully interactive development framework. It uses React.js under the covers. Super easy and intuitive to develop apps, ideal for data science and AI apps, built-in web server for testing. Now the cons: it's not designed for large-scale website applications, and that means whether you want to have millions of users using it or you just want to have it do heavy-duty lifting, and you really don't want to have thousands of web pages in something like a Streamlit app. So it's really more of a lightweight, medium size, but you can do a lot with it. So I don't want to put it down, but if you're looking to do something like, Amazon's main website with this, that probably would be overkill. And to scale properly, you really need to put some sort of a back end using something like Flask. In fact, I read a book related to developing Streamlit applications, and that's what the author did. He kind of talked about putting a database on the back end using Flask and controlling more of those types of things that tend to take a lot of overhead. So if you do need to scale up your Streamlit application, you can do it, but there's a point at which you probably would have been better using a more robust framework. And I will give you my number one thing I'm not wild about with Streamlit: it doesn't like to manage state. So you have to take over direct control over saving any values or anything that are entered into the page on your screen, because it forgets. Every time you do any action, it resets all of the data in your app. So it keeps losing the sense of what's happening, and it makes it difficult to control flow. It's pretty easy to correct that using state management commands. In other words, saving things as you go along, but it is probably the most annoying thing to do in Streamlit. However, you can see my thumbs up. Now let's talk about Django. Django is so awesome. I can't even tell you how much I like it. It's a beautiful framework. The word I would use for Django is elegant. Elegant means it does everything really well thought out. And what I really like about Django is there's a place for everything, and everything has a place, which I think makes maintainability, especially for large sites, a lot better. So let's look at the pros. The tagline for Django is a web development framework for perfectionists with deadlines. And I think that captures the essence of Django really well. You can actually develop very quickly with Django, though you do have to understand the framework pretty well to be able to speed things up a lot in your development, but it has a place for everything, and you can control everything. So if you're a perfectionist, you want everything to just look a certain way, you can do all that with Django. As I mentioned, it's a very sophisticated and logically laid out framework Folders have a place. It breaks things out in a very specific way, and it allows you to treat a folder as an app. So you create different apps within your overall web app, and you might have, for instance, an app that handles like user login and security, and another app could handle messaging and chatting. And what's nice about it, it makes it really easy to just sort of unplug a given part of your app out, and just through very little coding you can add or remove parts of your application. It comes with built-in services like support for databases, security admin, data table CRUD. Related to the database, you get an object relational mapper called an ORM, right? That's what they call them, ORM, object relational mapper, and a local web service so you can develop and test locally without having to deploy to some environment. Django is great for all size websites, but it's really good for large ones. In other words, you got lots of pages and lots of different functionality, and you want to maximize reuse. Django is highly configurable, and you can parameterize many parts of what you're doing using a language called Jinja. One of the things I like about it also is that there are a lot of forms that are pre-built. They're called class-based forms, and you can inherit them in your application and then just make slight adjustments. In some cases, you can just pick up pre-built forms and they will dynamically support your data without you doing any coding. So that's a really cool thing, and it's a way to get an app up and running very quickly. How much you use these things will depend on how much control you need to take, but I found it to be very powerful. Since it's Python, and since we have this parameterizing language, Jinja, and the way it's laid out using templates and forms and on, and everything's centered around either functions or I prefer the object-oriented approach, you can maximize reusability. Now, what's the cons? Well, you got a steep learning curve, right? Not only do you have to know Python well, but you're going to have to learn how the Django framework operates. And that's not trivial, I will give you that. But I found it to be really cool, so I didn't have any problem like this is great. You don't have one-click deployment, right? Django is pretty complicated, and getting it deployed to a given environment can also be complicated. Fortunately, there are some services out there, some cloud services that you can simplify this because they already want to make it easy for you to deploy your Django apps, and Django is extremely popular, so that's a big advantage. It is heavy on code, to say the least. It is all code centric, but as I mentioned, there's a lot of built-in classes for Django that make development a lot easier. The challenge is to learn Django well enough to take advantage of those services. It also provides a lot of services that don't require you to write any code. For instance, the security admin feature is built in and allows you to add, remove, and maintain security for your application, and you don't have to write anything for that. It's just built in and done. So thumbs up for Django. Not something necessarily if you're just looking to showcase your skills, that kind of thing, a portfolio. Don't think I would go with Django, but if you're looking to build a robust and powerful application, Django's a good go. Now again, this is only for web applications. It's not something we can deploy to like the Apple Store or Android Store or something like that. So one service I want to talk about a little bit is called Anvil. I saw a video a few years ago about this and I was really excited, and it was pre-Streamlit, and it is pretty cool. It does leverage open source frameworks, but it is generally controlled and used by this company called Anvil. The pros of Anvil are it is an all Python yet interactive environment to develop code, which underneath the covers uses React.js. So it's a little like Streamlit. It allows GUI development. So Streamlit is pretty much use code to create things. I think it's pretty easy. You don't really need a screen drag and drop kind of GUI environment, I don't think, with Streamlit. But with Anvil, you do get that. But it is their own custom tool, and the only way you can use it is if you're in their service on their website. Deployments are easy as long as you're deploying it to the Anvil cloud. Not so easy necessarily if you want to go somewhere else. The cons: it's very commercialized and it's limited to their cloud service if you want to have like easy deployment and services that they give you, especially the GUI development. There's no local development IDE, integrated development environment, client tool. So you're kind of stuck again with their web service to do that. And unless you go open source completely and self-host, your scalability to me seemed very limited when I was looking at their plans, and they seem to get pretty pricey pretty quickly. It didn't look very scalable to me. If you start getting into trillions of rows of data, it's not going to work real well. So the cost rises quickly when you start using their hosting. So overall, I gave it a thumbs down in terms of using it. If it fits your needs and you can use it, I would say it's probably one of the easiest, fastest ways to get an application up and running. But I think your control and your costs would be what might suffer a little bit. So I would be careful, take a look at it, but if it works for you, go for it. Now let's talk about the other elephant in the room when it comes to web application frameworks and Python, and that is Flask. Flask is awesome, but let's see, is it what we really need? Well, let's talk about the pros. It's Python based, right, like Django. It's very lightweight. We always say batteries included. Well, Django is like batteries upon batteries included. Everything you could ever want, probably too much in some ways. But Flask is not that. Flask doesn't give you much. It basically just gives you this sort of web development framework, which is great because from that you can build and have a lot of flexibility. So you just code what you need, integrates with just about anything. What's the cons? Well, there's not much included out of the box. With freedom comes the lack of help getting things done. It's not suited for large apps, in my opinion, because if you have thousands of web pages and lots of different templates and things going on, managing it all in Flask can get unwieldy. And because you don't have a sort of larger framework like Django, which sort of forces you to follow certain structural rules and where do you put things and how are things configured, I think Flask applications could get really hard to maintain pretty quickly. You have to code everything you need. There's nothing sort of built in for you. Overall, for my purposes, I give it a thumbs down, but it might fit your needs depending on what you're trying to do. What about the R language, Brian? I use R. That's all I use. That's all I ever want to use. Well, there is a great service. It's the first turnkey quick web app tool I ever saw out there, and it's called Shiny. Shiny is a lot like Streamlit, except it's written in the R language and it's based in the R language. It can be maintained and used beautiful from our studio. A lot of good things to say for Shiny. Let's talk about the pros. Well, like Streamlit for R, it's best for R developers. It has intuitive syntax and concepts. It's super easy to deploy to the Shiny service and you can do it right from our studio. Ideal for data science and AI apps. And those are really the takeaways I want you to have there. So if you focus mostly on R, if you want to showcase your R chops, this is a good tool to use and it's pretty cool and fun. Bear in mind, because R is not generally seen as an object-oriented language, the apps you're writing are not object-oriented. It's very function-oriented, and that leads to some difficulties, I think, simplifying the code and making it easier to read, which I'll talk about in a second here. So the function-based means I found it really hard to keep track because you end up nesting parentheses within parentheses within parentheses, and it might sound like that's not such a big deal, but when you get to be like 30 levels deep of parentheses, you can't figure out where the beginning one ends or where the other one ends, and you have to have that perfect or you're going to have problems. Now, somebody posted way back when I ran into this from our studio, and they said, hey, why don't you try using Flexboard? I haven't looked at using Flexboard. I don't even know if it's available anymore, but if you're trying to do Shiny, they may have integrated Flexboard, but Flexboard allowed you to kind of create a higher level sort of way to do your function calls that made it a lot less complicated. It is limited to the R language and stack, so if you're trying to demonstrate training models with Python and things, you may be a little stretched trying to do it Shiny. Overall though, in spite of those things, it is really good for what it's there for, working in the R language and building web apps. So I give it a thumbs up for that. So now let's talk about mobile app development. Let me just quickly point out what I will skip over and not talk about for now. Maybe in a future video. I didn't look closely at these, but the tools React Native, Ionic, and NativeScript, these all look like they're popular tools for building mobile apps using JavaScript. I'm skipping over those for now. I'm going to talk about the tools I looked at and what I've experimented with. I'll start with this interesting Python framework called Kivy. So Kivy is, interestingly, it is designed to write applications which run on mobile devices, but it does not support deploying those applications to the various mobile stores. In other words, you can't take your Kivy app and get it into the Apple Store. So let me walk through the pros. It's all Python and it is cross-platform and it's open source, so that's pretty cool. It has flexible layout managers, so you can have it go like in a grid, you can have it flow down. There's a bunch of different ways you can have your application run. And it supports different hand motions or mobile device actions like swiping. The cons, I've noticed in recent years, the releases are fairly infrequent. It looks like maybe about a year between the last release and the one before that, so I would worry a little bit about future support. And as I mentioned, you can't deploy it to app stores. And although it's very simple, because of its simplicity, I don't think it's ideal for writing really large apps with lots of code. Okay, let's look at Flutter and Flutterflow. What the heck is Flutter and Flutterflow? What's all the Flutter about? So Flutter is a framework developed by Google. It is open source. Internally, it builds itself on a language called Dart, which I'll talk a little about. Now, I don't think Flutter by itself is necessarily the best answer, but a recent tool, relatively recent, is something called Flutterflow, which seems to have really given a jump start to the Flutter framework, because Flutterflow allows you a no-code solution where you can just drag and drop, and then under the covers it's going to build the code for you, which is Flutter, which will in turn run Dart code. So let's walk through this a little bit. So the pros of Flutter. So Flutter and Flutterflow allow you to have full GUI drag and drop development. It has a great integrated development environment. It is cross-platform, and you will get fast execution of your apps because it will compile to those platforms. What are the cons? The biggest con in my mind is yet another language. We have a proliferation of languages, and honestly I would be happy just to see Python become the only language, not because I have a problem with the other languages per se, but all these languages are just syntax. Why do we need so many languages when the real issue is the underlying libraries and services they can implement? So that's my sort of challenge here, because everyone wants to write new languages and Google is no exception. So I'm not a fan of this idea of creating another language, and surprisingly it looks a lot like Java and C#. So if you use Flutterflow, great, but you may find yourself not being able to get the behavior you need. So then you'll have to go back and learn Flutter, which is the framework, and the Dart language. So you may suddenly find yourself not getting out of this so easy. An alternative to Flutter is called Flet, and I'm actually a lot more optimistic about Flet than I am Flutter. Why is that, Brian? Because what Flet does is it is a wrapper, as far as I can tell anyway, it's like sort of Python wrapper around Flutter. But it does more than that. So let's take a look at it. And you can see on the right side, I just wanted to kind of give you a flavor for what the code looks like. But you can see we just import Flet as FT. Of course, this means pip install Flet, right? Then just use the library. And you can see that we can set, here page.title. So we can set a page title. We can set alignment. You can see txt number. We're setting a text field about 5 lines down there. So all these things you can see, it looks very intuitive, and it looks like we're working with just a normal GUI application. So let's talk about the pros. It's a Python wrapper plus, meaning it is not just Python wrapping Flutter. Flet actually consolidates parts of what Flutter does to create more combined objects and services to make it a little bit easier to code. But it does leverage Flutter under the covers. And what are the cons? Well, Flet is not completely fleshed out, and the first 1.0 release is planned for 2024. I don't think it's been released yet, so we don't really know the full future of Flet. Will it get maintained? Will it be adopted? It needs a lot of new features. It's pretty cool. It's been developing very quickly. So although there are many features and parts of Flutter which have been implemented with Flet, there's still a long way to go. So you may find yourself not being able to do things you need to do, or doing a lot of extra coding to get around that for now. And because Flet is still new, and the questions I've just raised about what's implemented and development, there is the issue of maybe this won't last, maybe it will fail as a project, and you could be left kind of holding the bag on that. So in summary, we talked about why dev tools. I talked about a lot of different reasons. I think you can think of them yourself. The most popular probably being I need to build a portfolio, in which case probably your best option is going to Streamlit. But if you're looking at building and becoming the next trillionaire by building an app, look at some of the other tools I've talked about, because that may also fit your needs. The two main types of services are ones that build web apps that run in a browser versus those that run on mobile devices like iPhones and Android devices. And I talked about the goals, which are really my goals. I was looking for things that were super easy to use, get your app running quickly. If you do have to code, I prefer Python as the language. So it is a very skewed list, does not have to match your own. I think whenever you're looking to select tools, it should be specific to what you are trying to do. There is no silver bullet that will solve everyone's needs. Went through a quick list of the various services and we talked about them, and then I did a service by service highlight. That's it for this time. I want to thank you. Please share, like, subscribe. Until next time, I'm pulling for you. We're all in this together.